The house stood at the end of a long, winding road, hidden behind towering oak trees that seemed older than time itself. It had been abandoned for decades, or so they said. The townspeople avoided it, crossing to the other side of the street whenever they passed by. They whispered stories of disappearances, strange lights at night, and the feeling of being watched. Daniel hadn't believed in any of that. Not at first. The letter arrived unexpectedly. A legal notice informing him that his great-uncle, a man he had never met, had passed away and left him the mansion. No family, no will. Just a note from a lawyer stating that Daniel was the sole heir. It felt too good to be true. And it was. Daniel arrived at the mansion just before sunset. The iron gates creaked as he pushed them open, revealing a stone path overgrown with weeds. The house itself was massive, a decaying monument to a time long past. Ivy crawled up the stone walls and the windows were dark, empty, like hollow eyes staring back at him. He hesitated at the door, key in hand. A strange chill ran down his spine. It wasn't the cold, it was something else, something unseen. Brushing the feeling aside, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something metallic. Blood? No, that was impossible. He shook off the thought and moved forward. The grand foyer was eerily silent. An old chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated in dust. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, but it was the walls that caught his attention. Symbols, carved into the wood, deep and deliberate. Strange markings that he didn't recognize. Some looked like twisted versions of letters, others like claw marks. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the rough edges. A sudden sound made him jump. A whisper, faint, just behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness of the house. His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the silence. He pulled it out. One new message. Leave now. No number. No sender. Just those 2 words. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Was this someone's idea of a joke? He looked around, his paranoia growing. Then something moved. A shadow shifting along the far wall, slipping into the darkness of the hallway. His fingers tightened around his phone. He wanted to turn back to leave, but something held him in place. Curiosity. Or maybe something else. The whisper came again. Daniel. His blood ran cold. Someone, or something, knew his name. Daniel stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, his pulse hammering in his ears. The whisper had been clear, his name spoken in a voice that wasn't human. The phone in his hand felt ice cold. The text message still glowed on the screen. Leave now. A sane man would have turned around, left the house, and never looked back. But Daniel, he was never good at listening to warnings. The hallway stretched into darkness, the walls lined with portraits of unfamiliar faces. The eyes in the paintings seemed to follow him, watching, waiting. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse. As he reached the end of the hall, he saw it, an old wooden door slightly ajar. A strange, musty scent seeped from within. He hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. The air was colder here, damp and thick with the scent of rot. A single flickering light bulb cast long, shifting shadows on the stone walls. An old book sat on a table in the center of the room. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, but something about it felt wrong. The pages were yellowed, filled with inked symbols that matched the carvings on the walls. Daniel reached for it, his fingers brushing the cover. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the basement, slamming the door shut behind him. The whispering grew louder, voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. His breath turned to mist in the freezing air. He should have run. He should have left the book alone. But his hands moved on their own, flipping open the pages. The ink shimmered like fresh blood, forming words he could somehow read. We have waited. Daniel's vision blurred. The symbols on the page seemed to writhe and shift. A deep guttural voice echoed through the basement. Now you are ours. A sharp pain exploded in his chest and he collapsed to the floor, gasping. He clawed at his shirt, his skin burning like fire. When he pulled his hand away, his breath caught in his throat. They spread across his arms, pulsing, twisting beneath his skin like living things. His head throbbed, his vision darkening at the edges. And then, the whispering stopped. Silence. The air felt heavier, pressing down on him. His own breath sounded too loud. Then in the reflection of the metal table he saw it, a figure, standing behind him. Tall, gaunt, hollow black eyes that bore into him like twin voids, a grin that stretched too wide, revealing jagged teeth. Darkness swallowed Daniel whole. He didn't remember collapsing. He didn't remember closing his eyes. But when he opened them, he was somewhere else. Not the basement, not his house. Somewhere wrong. The air was thick, like breathing through water. The sky above him swirled in shades of crimson and black, shifting unnaturally. The ground beneath his feet felt like stone, but when he looked down it moved, pulsing like living flesh. Then, the whispering started again. Daniel, you are chosen. He turned, searching for the voice, but the shadow stretched endlessly, twisting and writhing like something alive. And then, from the darkness, something stepped forward. It was the figure from the basement, only now it wasn't just a shadow in the reflection, it was real. Its elongated fingers twitched, sharp nails scraping against each other. Its grin was too wide, its skin stretched too thin. You let us in, it said, voice deep and layered with many others. Daniel tried to step back, but his body wouldn't move. His muscles locked, as if unseen hands were gripping him in place. You belong to us now. A sharp pain erupted in his chest and he gasped, looking down. The black veins had spread further, crawling up his neck, wrapping around his wrists. His skin felt like it was burning from the inside out. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached for him. Daniel bolted upright, gasping for air. He was back in his bedroom. Sweat dripped from his forehead, his heart racing. It was just a dream. Just a nightmare, or so he thought. As he sat up, his eyes landed on the mirror across the room. His reflection wasn't right. It blinked slower than he did. Its grin lingered for a second too long, and then it moved on its own. Still think it's just a dream? It whispered. The room went ice cold. The lights flickered and the air grew heavy with something unseen, something watching. Daniel stumbled back, but his own reflection only smiled wider. Then, his body convulsed. Pain shot through his skull like a drill boring into his brain. His vision blurred, and suddenly he wasn't in control anymore. His hand moved on its own. He picked up a pen and started writing, frantically, violently on the walls. His handwriting, but not his words. Ancient symbols. Words in a language he had never seen but somehow understood. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fought against the force controlling him. But his body was no longer his own. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Daniel collapsed, panting, his hands shaking. He looked at the walls, at the words he had written, and then he saw the last line. He is inside you now. Daniel sat on the floor, staring at the words he had written on the walls. He is inside you now. His hands were still trembling. His breath was uneven. His reflection, it was gone. The mirror was empty, a black void where his own face should have been. Something was inside him, and it was awake. The next morning, Daniel barely recognized himself. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes looked darker, sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. The black veins on his arms had faded, but he could still feel them crawling under his skin. Something had changed. He wasn't alone in his own body anymore, and he needed answers. Daniel spent the next few hours digging through old records, searching for anything about his great-uncle and the house. What he found was worse than he imagined. The house had a history, a dark one. Every owner before him had died mysteriously, or disappeared without a trace. Some were found with their bodies contorted, bones shattered from the inside. Others had left behind only a single message scrawled in their own blood. It takes what it wants. His great-uncle was the last known owner, a recluse, a man obsessed with demonology and forbidden rituals. The townspeople feared him, spoke of strange sounds coming from the house at night, chanting, screams, voices that didn't belong to this world. Daniel's stomach twisted as he flipped through an old newspaper article. Mysterious disappearance, local man vanishes, basement found sealed shut. He turned the page, a photo of his great-uncle, and beneath it, a symbol, the same one carved into his own skin. Daniel stumbled back, his pulse racing. This thing inside him, it wasn't new. It had been waiting, watching, and now it had him. A sharp pain stabbed through his skull, forcing him to his knees. His vision blurred. The room around him seemed to darken, shadows stretching unnaturally, and then a voice. "You cannot fight me." It came from everywhere, from inside his head, from the walls, from the empty mirror. "You let me in, Daniel." His own mouth moved, but it wasn't his voice that spoke. "And now, you are mine." The walls pulsed. The floor shifted beneath him. The room wasn't real anymore. He saw flashes. A burning altar. A man screaming as black smoke poured from his mouth. A figure standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. And then, a name. Malphus. The demon had a name, and now it had a body. Daniel's body. Daniel collapsed to the floor, clutching his head. The name burned inside his mind like fire. The demon that had haunted this house. The entity that had taken his great-uncle. The thing that was now inside him. His body trembled. His breath came in shallow gasps. The black veins on his arms pulsed as if something beneath his skin was alive. Moving, growing stronger. "You cannot resist me, Daniel," the voice whispered. "Your body is mine now." Daniel fought against it. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand. He wouldn't let this thing control him. He wouldn't be its puppet. But the room around him twisted and warped. The shadows deepened, stretching toward him like living things. The walls cracked open, revealing an endless abyss beyond. A dark figure stepped forward. Tall, hollow-eyed. Its grin split across its face like a jagged wound. It was no longer just a presence inside him. It was here. Daniel's hands moved on their own. He reached for the book on the table, the cursed book that had started all of this. The pages flipped violently, stopping on a passage written in dark, shimmering ink. A ritual, a way to end this. But it came with a price. "You think you can cast me out?" Malphus laughed, his voice layered with 1,000 echoes. "You are nothing, Daniel. You are weak." Daniel gritted his teeth. He had no choice. If he didn't fight now, he would be lost forever. He began chanting the words in the book. The air thickened. The house shook. The shadows screamed. Malphus roared, his grin vanishing into a snarl. "Stop!" Daniel's voice grew stronger. He spoke the words faster, louder. His vision blurred, the black veins on his arms burning, turning to ash. Malphus staggered back, his form flickering, distorting. "No, this body is mine." The room exploded in a blinding white light, a deafening scream, then silence. Daniel woke up on the floor, his body drenched in sweat. The room was still, the air was cold but normal. The demon was gone, or so he thought. As he stood up, his eyes landed on the mirror. His reflection was there, but it wasn't moving. Then it grinned and whispered, "I never left." Daniel stared at the mirror. His reflection stood perfectly still except for its mouth, grinning, stretching unnaturally wide. His own voice echoed from inside the glass, but he wasn't speaking. "I never left." A chill ran down his spine. His fingers twitched, his breath hitched in his throat. He had performed the ritual, he had spoken the incantation. Malphus should be gone. But the thing in the mirror, it was still there. Watching. Waiting. Days passed, but Daniel could feel it, the presence. It wasn't controlling his body anymore, but it was still inside him, lurking, whispering when the world around him was silent. Every time he walked past a mirror, he felt it. A flicker in the glass. A shadow moving when he stood still. A pair of black eyes staring back at him. It wasn't just the mirrors. The house had changed too. The floors creaked under invisible footsteps. The doors locked and unlocked on their own. The walls whispered in voices he didn't recognize. And at night, the breathing, low, deep. Just outside his bedroom door, waiting. One night, Daniel snapped. He grabbed a hammer and smashed the mirror into pieces, watching as the shards scattered across the floor. For the first time in weeks, he felt free. But then, a sound. A deep, guttural chuckle. It wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was behind him. Daniel turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was empty. but the air felt thick like something unseen was pressing against him. Then, his own voice spoke. "You can't break me." A sharp pain shot through his skull, forcing him to his knees. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through his head. His fingers dug into his scalp, trying to block them out, but they grew louder. 1,000 voices, 1,000 shadows, all speaking in unison. "You are mine." Daniel gasped as his vision darkened. His limbs turned cold. The world around him vanished. He woke up in a place that wasn't his room, it wasn't his house, it wasn't anywhere. Just darkness, and in front of him, a single mirror. Inside it was himself. But it wasn't him, it was Malphus, grinning, reaching out. And as Daniel tried to run, the mirror pulled him in. His scream faded into the void. The next morning, the house was empty. The police found no trace of Daniel, only a single mirror standing in the middle of the room. And if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest sound. A voice, a whisper. "Let me out." The house stood empty, cold, silent, forgotten. Daniel was gone. His disappearance became a local mystery, another strange case added to the house's dark history. Weeks passed, then months, and eventually, someone new moved in. Her name was Emily Carter, a young journalist, curious and fearless. She had heard the stories, the missing owners, the strange occurrences, the whispers in the walls, but she didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in facts. And this house? This was her next big story. She unpacked her bags, set up her cameras, and started documenting everything. Nothing happened at first. No footsteps, no voices, no moving shadows. It was just a house, or so she thought. Then, on the third night, she found the mirror. It was in the basement, covered in dust, its surface cracked but intact. It didn't match the rest of the house, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Emily wiped the dust away, revealing something carved into the frame, a single word. Malphus. She shivered but shook it off. It was just an old mirror, right? She aimed her camera at it, adjusting the focus. That's when she saw it. The reflection moved, but she hadn't. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, but her reflection stayed where it was, staring at her, and then it smiled. Not her smile. Something wrong. Something hungry. A deep, distorted voice echoed from the glass. "Let me out." The room darkened. The air grew thick. Emily stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She grabbed her camera and ran upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. But the whisper followed her. "You found me." Her reflection in the hallway mirror twitched. The grin was back, wide, unnatural. Emily's own voice spoke to her. "Now, I will find you." That night, the whispers didn't stop. They came from every mirror, every window, every reflective surface. Emily covered them all. She turned them against the wall, shattered them, refused to look, but it didn't matter, because in her dreams, she still saw him, Daniel, or what was left of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. His lips moved, but his voice wasn't his own anymore. He's still inside. Then his face twisted, his skin cracked open, and Malphus crawled through. Emily jerked awake, gasping for air. Her room was dark except for a single small mirror she had forgotten to cover, and in it, he was watching, his voice, calm, amused. "You will let me in." The lights flickered. A shadow moved. The air turned cold, and behind her, something breathed. Emily sat frozen in her bed, every muscle locked in fear. The mirror was small, barely the size of her palm, but inside it, he was there, watching, grinning, and behind her. Something moved. She didn't turn around. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The air behind her had changed, thick and suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing against her. A slow creak sounded from the floor. The thing, whatever it was closer now. Then, a hand touched her shoulder, cold, bony. "Wrong," Emily screamed. She threw herself forward, knocking over the mirror. It shattered against the floor, and for a moment, Everything went still. The house fell silent. The air was normal again. Had it worked? Had she broken the connection? She took a shaky breath and turned around. Nothing was there, just an empty room, just her pounding heart, just her ragged breath. She let out a weak laugh. It was over. Or so she thought. That night, Emily dreamt of Daniel again. But this time he wasn't speaking. He was screaming, his mouth stretched open wider and wider as if something inside him was trying to force its way out. His eyes rolled back, black veins crawling across his skin. And then, a voice, deep, ancient, inescapable. You broke the mirror. Emily shuddered in her sleep. The voice was inside her head now. That only sets me free. Her body twitched violently. She couldn't wake up. She couldn't move. Something was pressing into her chest, sinking deeper, claiming her, and then she opened her eyes, but she wasn't looking through her own. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the mirror. She should have been terrified. She should have been running, but instead, she smiled. Not her smile. Something else's. Something ancient. Something hungry. She tilted her head, studying her reflection. Then in a voice that was no longer hers, she whispered, "Now it begins." Emily was gone, not physically, not completely, but whatever she had been, the journalist, the skeptic, the woman who wanted the truth, was no longer there. What stood in her place now was something else, something older, something hungry. She left the house that morning, walking down the street like an ordinary person. No one noticed the wrongness in her steps, the unnatural way her head tilted when she looked at people passing by. No one noticed how her shadow stretched too far, how it flickered like it wasn't really hers. She smiled at strangers, and when they smiled back, they felt it. A chill down their spine, a whisper they couldn't quite hear, a sudden, unexplainable fear, and before they knew it, they had taken something home with them. A whisper in the dark, a shadow behind the door, a presence in the mirror. And so, it spread. The disappearances started soon after. First a child gone without a trace, his bedroom mirror found shattered on the floor. Then, a businessman, vanishing overnight, his phone left behind, still recording something breathing on the other end of the call. One by one they disappeared, and those who stayed, they changed. Their smiles stretched too wide. Their eyes were just a little too dark, and at night, if you listened closely, you could hear them whispering. The legend grew. The stories spread. People whispered of the demon's mark, of reflections that weren't quite right, of a voice calling from the glass. Let me in. Some believed it was just another urban legend. Some laughed at the warnings. Some stared at their own reflections just a little too long, and those were the ones who never laughed again. Because once you see him, once you hear him, it's already too late. He's inside, watching, waiting, and when the time is right, he will take you too.